A flight attendant flushed a baby's medicine mid-flight, but he had no idea the father owned the jet, and the situation flipped instantly. A flight attendant flushed the baby's medicine, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the father owned the entire jet and could turn the act into instant consequences. The moment the medicine disappeared, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The cabin door sealed with a quiet thud, locking out the world below. Inside the private jet, silence briefly took over. Clean, pressurized, artificial. Draven Keller, cradling his infant son, Leron, in one arm, adjusted the thin blanket over the baby's chest with his other hand. The overhead lighting was dim, smooth, and warm, engineered for luxury, but the air felt too still, almost staged. He eased Leron into the portable bassinet beside his seat, the infant's tiny breath rising and falling with the rhythm of trust and unawareness only children could possess. Just across the aisle, Milo Dane secured their brief luggage, his sharp gaze scanning the overhead compartments, not out of habit, but out of instinct. Milo wasn't merely Draven's assistant, he was his filter, the buffer between fragile plans and chaotic variables. And today, something felt misaligned. The jet was pristine, polished to corporate perfection, but Milo had noticed the subtle stiffness in the flight attendant's greeting. Rennick Vale had smiled, yes, but it was the kind of smile that wanted to be mistaken for hospitality, stretched thin across something darker. Rennick's footsteps now echoed faintly on the cabin flooring as he moved toward the galley. He was too quiet for a man in service. No pleasantries, no redundant check-ins, no offers for comfort. Just silence. Milo glanced toward the back of the cabin where the galley curtain stirred briefly. Rennick hadn't returned since they boarded. That, in itself, wasn't unusual, except for the lingering glance the attendant had given earlier to the small medicine bottle clipped to the side of Leron's diaper bag. Draven hadn't noticed it. His thoughts were in Miranthor, rehearsing every line of the presentation that could unlock the next phase of his infant monitoring system, a device capable of detecting early signs of respiratory distress in newborns. Years of research, dozens of clinical trials, and now a pitch that might change everything. He had insisted on bringing Leron. The irony was bitter, now that Milo's instincts were warning him something about this trip wasn't right. "You noticed that, didn't you?" Milo's voice was low, meant only for Draven as he sat back down across the aisle. Draven glanced up. "What?" The look, when Rennick saw the bottle. Draven followed Milo's gaze to the now-shadowed galley. "I assumed he was reading the label." "He wasn't. He was judging it." Draven said nothing for a moment. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions. But Milo's instincts were rarely wrong. The medicine, just a few ounces of a clear liquid, was a tailored blend prescribed to help Leron's developing lungs adapt to altitude changes. Rare, yes. Necessary, absolutely. A soft, mechanical hum signaled the cabin pressurization stabilizing. The jet rolled forward, taxiing into the early evening dusk. Below them, Veltron Terminal's golden lights bled across the tarmac like distant fireflies. Draven tightened the strap across the bassinet's frame and double-checked the seal on Leron's bottle. The infant stirred slightly, a soft sound barely audible. Draven gently placed 2 fingers on the baby's chest. Rise, fall, steady. He nodded to himself. All was calm, except it wasn't. In the cockpit, the muffled voice of the captain crackled over the internal comm, announcing a smooth ascent and clear skies en route to Miranthor. The words were standard, reassuring, but the real storm wasn't above them. As the jet began to lift, Rennick emerged quietly from the galley. He walked down the aisle with deliberate steps, pausing only once, just long enough to glance again at the bassinet, at the bottle, then at Draven. "Need anything before we reach cruising altitude?" Rennick asked. His voice was neutral. Too neutral. Not polite, not warm. measured. Draven looked up. "We're fine, thank you." Rennick nodded, but his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. Milo leaned forward in his seat, his fingers loosely folded over one knee, every sense alert. The attendant turned and walked away, but not before Draven caught it, the subtle shift in his jaw. A clench, controlled, suppressed. Something unspoken passed in that moment, and Draven couldn't explain why, but it disturbed him. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't professionalism. It was something in between, a quiet decision forming behind a polite mask. Draven looked down at his son again. Laurent's tiny fingers curled around the edge of the bassinet blanket. Oblivious, trusting. The thought hit harder now. He had built his entire life around safeguarding infants through science, through hardware, algorithms, and medical advances. But this was something he couldn't code against. A human variable. Milo shifted, unfastening his belt with a smooth, practiced motion. "You want me to secure the bag below?" Draven nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off Rennick's silhouette now stationed near the front of the cabin. "Yes, and check the emergency kit near the forward storage panel while you're at it. Just in case." In case of what? Draven hesitated. He didn't have a name for it yet. Just a sensation, heavy and silent, tightening in the air. In case what we're feeling is right. Milo disappeared briefly toward the storage panel. Draven, now alone with Laurent again, reached down and unhooked the medicine bottle. He turned it over slowly in his hand, watching the fluid shift inside like a fragile answer waiting to be protected. He clipped it back against the bag, more firmly this time. The cabin lights dimmed just slightly, settling into cruise mode. Rennick turned once more, then disappeared back into the galley without a word. Draven's fingers curled around the armrest. The jet now leveled out into high sky. It was supposed to be an easy flight. It would not be. The storm, waiting inside the cabin, was still unseen. Draven's hand was still outstretched when Rennick Vale reached forward and took the small medicine bottle from his grip. "I'll need to inspect this for cabin safety," Rennick said, his voice smooth but sharp at the edges, like velvet stretched over wire. Draven blinked, his fingers loosening as the bottle was taken. Something about the request didn't sit right with him, but his mind immediately searched for protocol. Maybe pressurized containers had restrictions. Maybe he missed a policy change. He didn't want to appear difficult. He gave a slight nod, though uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Milo, seated diagonally across the aisle, stiffened. His gaze locked on Rennick. It wasn't just the request, it was the way the flight attendant's hand gripped the bottle, fingers curling a fraction tighter than necessary, thumb tapping slowly against the label, eyes lingering as if waiting for an excuse. "Cabin safety?" Milo echoed quietly under his breath. He didn't buy it. Rennick didn't immediately move. He stood there, cradling the bottle in his palm like it contained more than liquid, like it held a fence. The baby's soft, sleepy breathing had turned into a light whimper, a noise that cracked the surface of calm surrounding Draven like a hairline fracture in glass. He reached out again, hand steady. "That medicine is prescribed. It's for Laron's airway regulation, mild apnea onset." Rennick tilted his head slightly as though dissecting not the bottle, but the man in front of him. "Of course," he replied. His tone was agreeable, but the words came too slowly, too measured, like they had to pass through a filter of spite first. "Just routine." He turned abruptly and walked down the narrow aisle, each step stiff with something unresolved. Draven watched him vanish toward the galley. He didn't move for a moment. His breath held. Then he stood, but Milo was already on his feet. "I'll go," Milo said quickly, already moving toward the rear of the aircraft. "Stay with Laurent." But they both froze as the galley door clicked shut. Inside, Rennick stared at the silver sink in front of him. The hum of the jet's engines filled the space like background noise in his mind. His jaw flexed. He looked down at the bottle in his hand, eyes tracing the printed instructions, the emergency dosage marks, the prescription seal. He hated them, these little artifacts of dependency people carried as status tokens. It always came back to the same thing: passengers thinking they were above rules, above review, above him. Rennick muttered something under his breath, something incoherent and venom-laced. "They always lie," he whispered. "Everyone thinks their child is the exception." His hand tightened. Back in the cabin, Laurent began to fuss louder. The soft cry grew shrill. Draven gently rocked him, his calm outward expression now chipped by the rising pitch of panic beneath the surface. He looked toward the galley, his engineer's brain ticking. If the bottle was compromised, if it was touched, contaminated, or removed, there would be no backup. Laurent's next apnea flare could tighten his lungs in minutes. Draven stood, adjusting the infant carrier over his chest, stepping into the aisle just as the plane tilted slightly. The sudden turbulence rocked the fuselage and Draven stumbled forward, hand bracing against the wall. Milo caught up behind him. Then came the sound. A metallic splash. Liquid against steel. Draven's breath caught. He froze mid-step, hand reaching for the galley handle. He opened the door. Rennick emerged, his expression alarmingly neutral. In one hand, he held the now empty bottle. In the other, a cleaning cloth, as if this were just routine maintenance. But there was something behind his eyes, a deep, quiet satisfaction, like a man who had just proven a point no one else would ever understand. "Item didn't meet safety standards," Rennick said simply. "Wasn't sealed to code." Draven stared at him, not speaking. His arms remained still, Laurent now wailing against his chest. The jet's lights flickered slightly as it passed through another layer of cloud, casting Rennick's face in a brief strobe of white and shadow. "That was the only dose," Draven said. His voice was too calm, too level, but his eyes had changed, no longer uncertain, only focused. Rennick gave a small shrug. "Safety protocols, you understand." Milo stepped forward, fists clenched, but Draven stopped him with a glance. He took one breath, two, then looked down at Laurent's tearful face, cheeks flushed red, chest rising too fast. "We're not done," Draven said quietly before stepping past Rennick. He didn't look back, but even without seeing it, he could feel the weight of the attendant's smugness clinging to the air behind him, confident, unchallenged. For now. He settled back into his seat, cradling Laurent tighter, scanning the cabin in silence. Milo sat beside him, checking his bag quickly for any trace of spare medicine. Nothing. The lines on Draven's face hardened. He pulled out his tablet, fingers moving rapidly through encrypted menus, bypassing standard interfaces. Rennick moved slowly down the aisle, back to his jump seat, as though nothing had happened. And behind him, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The warmth was gone. What remained was a cold tension, like wires stretched to their limits, waiting to snap. Draven's hand paused on the screen. And Rennick's next decision would shatter that line completely. Rennick Vale moved with abrupt, unsettling purpose, clutching the small medicine bottle as if it were a dangerous object only he understood. The motion was so sudden that Draven froze for a brief second, his hand still extended. He watched Rennick's grip tighten around the bottle, the man's knuckles turning faintly pale, and a sharp pulse of unease struck Draven's chest. He stepped forward, voice steady but firm. "The medicine is essential for my son's breathing stability," he reminded him, trying to anchor the moment in reason. But Rennick's eyes flickered, not with understanding, but with a strange blend of irritation and defiance that made Milo straighten instantly from his seat. Before Draven could say another word, Rennick stepped backward, swift and calculated, and turned toward the galley. The narrow aisle amplified the echo of his heels as he pushed the galley door shut with a subtle snap. Milo took a step forward, instinct rising like a surge he couldn't suppress, but the door locked into place before he could reach it. The metal latch clicked, a small sound that somehow felt far heavier in meaning. Inside the galley, Rennick stood facing the sink, his shoulders rising and falling in tense rhythm. His thoughts spun with an intensity that pushed aside logic. In his mind, he was acting as a guardian of safety, a self-assigned protector who believed passengers often exaggerated their needs. He muttered under his breath, pacing slightly, convincing himself of a narrative only he could understand. The cold, fluorescent light above him cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the look of growing resentment in his eyes. Outside, Draven unbuckled his seatbelt so quickly that the metal clasp smacked softly against the seat. Turbulence shook the aircraft just then, causing him to brace a hand against the wall as he moved toward the galley. Milo followed immediately, his movements sharp and controlled, but worry carved a clear line across his face. Draven's heartbeat picked up as a faint sound reached him, running water. It was distant, yet unmistakable. His breath caught. "Milo," Draven said quietly, though fear had already begun to press against his voice. Milo didn't answer. He didn't have to. The dread was mutual and immediate. Both men reached the galley door at the same moment the turbulence eased, and in that fragile silence they heard it clearly. The distinct splash of liquid hitting metal, a sound final enough to hollow out Draven's chest. His hand froze on the handle. His grip tightened unconsciously. The truth arrived with the force of a physical blow. The door opened a moment later. Rennick stepped out, holding the now empty bottle. His expression was not apologetic. It was coldly satisfied, as if he expected someone to commend him for enforcing his interpretation of what was allowed on this flight. Water droplets clung to the edge of the bottle, catching the overhead light in a way that made Draven's stomach twist. Draven stared at him, unable to form a single word. His breath came slow and shallow, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. He felt the aircraft's engine hum beneath his feet, but it seemed distant, almost unreal. For a moment, the world narrowed to the empty bottle, Rennick's expression, and the faint echo of water that still rang in his ears. Behind him, Laron began to cry. Loud, distressed, urgent. The sound cut through the thick air like a blade, tightening every muscle in Draven's body. He turned slightly, instinctively ready to move toward his son, but his eyes remained locked on Rennick, who stood with squared shoulders prepared to defend his actions. Milo stepped closer to Draven and whispered, "Maybe there's backup medicine in the luggage." But the look Draven gave him carried the truth. There wasn't. This was the only dose for hours. Rennick straightened his posture, jaw set, bracing himself as if he were the one under threat. He did not understand, could not understand, that he had ignited something far larger than a disagreement in the aisle. Draven inhaled slowly, gathering the fragile threads of composure he had left. His shock began to settle into something far sharper, colder, and infinitely more focused. The stakes had risen. The flight had shifted, and Draven's next decision would determine everything that followed. He exhaled once, steadying himself, his mind already moving from panic to calculation in the span of a heartbeat. And the first move he made would change the entire flight's fate. The cries pierced the silence like a siren. Laron's sobs echoed through the cabin, frantic and sharp as Draven instinctively pulled his son into his arms. The infant's face flushed red from the sudden disruption to his breathing routine, and his tiny chest rose and fell with shallow, panicked effort. Draven cradled him close, murmuring softly, words too quiet to be heard but full of calm, an anchor against the building storm. Every muscle in Draven's face was tight, but his eyes remained focused. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not with Laron's fragile system unraveling in his arms. Across the aisle, Milo had already shifted, stepping between Draven and the flight attendant as if forming a human shield. His stance was quiet but resolute, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed with a silent question. "What are you going to do next, Vale?" Rennick Vale, for his part, stood unusually upright, hands behind his back, as if bracing for a medal instead of a confrontation. His voice, when it came, was clinical, devoid of remorse. "I acted in accordance with safety protocol," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "Unverified liquid medications must be disposed of when—" "Stop!" Draven's voice cut through the air, not loud, not angry, but final. It was the kind of voice used by men who didn't ask to be heard. He stood, gently adjusting Laurent in the crook of his arm, rocking him as best he could. The infant's whimpering quieted slightly, but his breathing remained uneven. Draven didn't waste words. He turned his gaze on Rennick, calm but unmistakably cold. "I need access to the emergency medical kit," he said. "Now." Rennick's expression didn't shift. "Passengers are not permitted to access crew compartments without express authorization," he replied smoothly, as if reading from a script. "I'm afraid—" "You're not afraid," Draven interrupted again. "You're asserting control." That landed. Rennick's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Draven took a slow breath, keeping his voice even. "I'm requesting access to the oxygen supplements or any backup medical kits stored near the forward galley." Rennick didn't move. He simply tilted his head. Not without captain approval. The refusal wasn't policy, it was personal. Draven saw it clearly now. This wasn't about safety. This was about ego, resentment, and control. A man like Rennick wasn't defending rules, he was defending his power over someone he believed had none. Milo's hand hovered near his tablet, fingers ready. He met Draven's gaze briefly, and Draven gave the smallest nod. Laron whimpered again, a wheeze catching in his throat. It wasn't just crying now, it was struggle. The stakes shifted in real time, snapping into focus. Draven's objective was no longer the city of Miranthor, no longer the funding meeting, no longer the future of his project. It was this moment, this breath, this child. Without looking away from Rennick, Draven began reviewing the cabin in his mind. Blueprints, layouts, technical specifications he'd personally approved when the aircraft was built under the Linthera Air Holdings shell. He remembered which compartments housed emergency reserves. He recalled the lock configurations, the biometric overrides. He hadn't planned to use them, but that had changed. The jet shuddered slightly, minor turbulence, nothing serious, but it was enough to rattle a glass in the galley, and cause Rennick to reach for the nearby panel to steady himself. In that fractional break of posture, Draven stepped forward. "I need to speak with the captain," he said. No emotion, just resolve. Rennick blinked. "That's not—" "It is," Draven said flatly. "I have that right." For a heartbeat, confusion passed over Rennick's face, subtle but visible. He didn't understand where this authority was coming from. To him, Draven was just another calm, well-dressed passenger with a baby. But something was shifting. Something in the way Draven stood, the way he spoke, the way Milo's fingers tapped with practiced rhythm on the tablet now glowing in his hands. Behind Rennick, the soft lighting of the forward cabin created a narrow spotlight, casting long shadows across the aisle. Milo stepped forward, holding the device at an angle only Draven could fully read. The screen displayed a sealed set of credentials, digital, encrypted, bearing the unmistakable emblem of Linthera Air Holdings. "Confirmation prepared," Milo said quietly, his voice low and level. Rennick squinted, trying to parse what he saw, but it was too late. Draven didn't need to explain. The screen showed everything: ownership clearance, oversight access, emergency override authority, Rennick's name, his current assignment, the aircraft registration number, all underneath a bold identifier, asset owner, Draven Keller. Foreshadowing dripped from the moment like oil on steel. Rennick's eyes widened a fraction, confusion now tangled with disbelief. The passenger he had denied, the man he had disrespected, was the very owner of the aircraft. But pride is a powerful force. Rather than back down, Rennick gave a tight nod and said, "I'll notify the captain," his voice tight, almost bitter. He turned and walked toward the cockpit, every step suddenly stiffer than the last. Milo didn't speak. He simply handed Draven the tablet, now silently broadcasting backup communication readiness. Leiron's breathing remained shallow, but his cries had faded to soft, pained huffs. Droven held him close, gently rocking him, whispering again, not to calm the child this time, but to keep himself composed. They were seconds from resolution or escalation. The moment hung in a delicate balance. The truth was on the verge of surfacing. Authority was about to shift hands. And, for the first time, Rennick Vale looked like a man uncertain of his place on the plane. Draven stepped forward once more, posture firm, voice quiet but unmistakably sharp as he said, and with his next words, the truth behind who he really was would begin to surface. "Captain, I need to speak with him. Now." The words dropped with deliberate calm, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Rennick Vale blinked, caught off guard. His brows lifted, not in concern but in confusion at the authority behind the request. This wasn't panic. It wasn't the desperate plea of an irate parent. It was a command. Draven Keller stood firm in the narrow aisle, handing his whimpering son, Leiron, carefully to Milo, who accepted the infant with practiced ease. Milo, ever composed, cradled the child against his chest, 2 fingers already checking the boy's pulse behind his tiny ear. The infant's chest heaved too fast, his skin paler than before. Oxygen flow was thinning. They were running out of time. "You're not authorized to make that request," Rennick snapped, attempting a smile that never formed. "Only senior-level passengers with bridge credentials." Draven didn't argue. He simply turned his tablet toward the attendant, his fingers gliding across the smooth interface with surgical precision. A biometric scan. A digital seal. And there it was, the unmistakable crest of Linthera Air Holdings glowing faintly on the screen, accompanied by secure authorization override codes. Rennick's mouth opened slightly, eyes narrowing as the reality dawned on him. Beneath the clearance banner his own name appeared, logged beside his crew assignment for this exact flight. Just below it, bold and irrefutable, was the registration tag marking Draven Keller as the legal controller and technical owner of the aircraft. A silence fell, a new kind, one that didn't come from shock but exposure. The kind of silence that made people realize they had just miscalculated everything. "This is your aircraft?" Rennick asked, voice brittle. Draven didn't answer. He didn't need to. Milo did it for him, with just a stare, sharp, unblinking, the sort of look that made grown men check their footing. Rennick shifted, suddenly unsure of his stance. Draven spoke quietly. "The medical override protocol grants access to all infant emergency reserves. I'm invoking it now. Step aside." But Rennick's pride, already bruised, hardened. He muttered, "Power doesn't exempt people from protocol. Abuse of position won't change policy." And with that, he turned, marching stiffly toward the cockpit like a man clinging to a script no longer valid. Draven followed, measured but firm. The cabin felt narrower with each step, shadows cast by overhead lights sharpening the contours of his face. His composure held, but only just. Inside the cockpit, Captain Velric Dane glanced up, surprised. He was a man in his mid-50s, quiet, experienced, and until this moment unaware that the man approaching was anything more than a father trying to calm a child. Draven handed him the tablet. Velric's fingers tapped, brows furrowing as he reviewed the credentials. He stood without a word. "Behind you," he said quietly, gesturing to a narrow compartment panel tucked into the wall behind the co-pilot's chair. A soft click, a hiss of pressure releasing, and the compartment opened to reveal a sealed backup infant medical kit, stamped with a code verifying its recent inspection. The kit was designed for precisely this kind of emergency: delayed administration due to turbulence or contamination. Velric handed it to Rennick. The attendant hesitated, holding the container with trembling fingers, the full weight of the moment settling into his shoulders. He turned, face pale, as if trying to calculate whether defiance would still serve him here. "Give it to the father," the captain said, low but final. Rennick stepped aside. Draven took the kit without a word, returned to Milo, and knelt beside him. He opened the casing with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. No hesitation, no fumbling. Inside, a pre-filled vial and micro-dispensing syringe awaited. He checked the dosage. Clean. Accurate. No expiration flags. Leiron's tiny body was curling inward, soft cries coming in gasping pulses. Draven steadied the infant's jaw, whispering softly, "Almost there, son." The syringe released a calibrated mist into the boy's mouth. A moment passed, then another. Leiron inhaled, once, sharp and shallow, then again, slower. His face flushed with new color. The tension in his limbs loosened as his breathing regulated. The silence that followed was deeper than before, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of recovery. Milo exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. He gently rocked Leiron in his arms, watching the boy's eyes drift toward sleep. Draven stood slowly, every movement calculated, unshaken. His eyes found Rennick. The attendant looked away, but Draven didn't. He had seen something in Rennick's behavior that went beyond arrogance. It was the deliberate abuse of assumed control, weaponized not against an adult, but against a child. That kind of breach wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a liability in uniform. Draven returned to his seat. The soft hum of the engines resumed its lull. The shadows in the cabin no longer flickered with uncertainty, but with clarity. His son was safe, but this was far from over. And that was something he would not let go unanswered. Draven didn't hesitate. The moment he reached his seat, he opened the leather-bound console built into the armrest and activated the secure uplink to Linthera's internal network. A faint chime echoed as the biometric scanner read his fingerprint, verifying his identity. No emotion flickered across his face. His hands moved quickly, methodically. The artificial calm in the dimmed cabin couldn't drown the weight of what had just happened. Leiron stirred faintly against Milo's shoulder, his breath still uneven. Milo gently bounced him, whispering, "You're all right, little one." But his eyes stayed locked on Draven. Draven didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every keystroke carried his intent. With a flick of his wrist, Draven brought up the aircraft's internal surveillance log. The footage from the galley, audio and video, was already cached. He isolated the last 15 minutes, enhancing the moment Rennick had taken the bottle, the way he held it with that peculiar arrogance, and most damningly, the sharp splash that came just before he stepped back into the aisle, empty-handed. Draven selected the file. Then the voice log from the medical cabinet sensor, which had automatically recorded the bottle being removed from the inventory. Then a time-stamped entry from the cockpit locker's pressure gauge, which would later confirm the emergency dosage kit's retrieval. Evidence. All of it methodically collated, tethered together with clinical precision. Milo watched, brows furrowed. "Are you sure you want to send it already?" Draven's eyes didn't leave the screen. He acted without authorization, endangered an infant, blocked access to emergency medical equipment, lied to the captain, then tried to stand behind a protocol. His voice didn't rise. It sank, heavy, weighted with finality. He didn't just make a mistake. He made a choice. He tapped the final command. The data packet launched through a secure relay to Linthera's Emergency Compliance Division. The recipient was one man, Calder Varen. The name alone was enough to make senior staff uneasy. Varen had built a reputation for zero-tolerance enforcement, especially in cases involving passenger endangerment. Draven had met him once, years ago, at a conference on private aviation standards. The man had eyes like wet stone, cold, unmoved by apology. But that's exactly why Draven trusted him. Across the cabin, Rennick Vale sat stiffly, arms crossed, back upright, trying to pretend he wasn't watching. But his glances betrayed him, quick, darting, increasingly unsettled. His confidence had started to fracture when Draven revealed his ownership of the aircraft. Now, it was eroding in real time. Then it happened. A sharp double tone rang from the aircraft's main terminal, a system notification from Linthera's compliance network. Rennick's head snapped toward the sound. Draven didn't look up, but Milo did. He leaned toward the display, lips parting in a low whistle. He's being streamed. What? Live streamed, Milo said again, glancing over his shoulder. Varen activated a Category 2 accountability review. Everything you just uploaded is already being reviewed by their disciplinary board in real time. Rennick stood, not abruptly, but carefully, the way a man stands when he realizes the floor beneath him is beginning to crumble. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight, almost pleading beneath the forced professionalism. Draven turned then, just enough to meet Rennick's gaze across the aisle. "I'm holding you accountable," he said. The light in the cabin dimmed for nighttime cruising, casting a soft purple hue over the polished fixtures. Outside, the sky stretched black and endless, stars cold and silent. Inside, the only movement came from the slow rise and fall of Laurent's tiny chest as he slept in Milo's arms. Rennick took a hesitant step forward, but Milo didn't flinch. He held the child closer, not protectively but with unmistakable trust that Draven had already ensured they were safe. Rennick opened his mouth to speak, but the cabin speaker beat him to it. "Mr. Keller," came the captain's voice, "Compliance Officer Varen has acknowledged receipt of your submission. Acknowledgement code has been sent to your console. Please advise if any further actions are requested before descent." Draven gave a calm nod to no one in particular. "Acknowledged. No additional requests at this time." Rennick's face shifted. Not angry now, just pale. His hands fell to his sides. He realized what had just happened. This wasn't a passenger complaining. This was the owner prosecuting. Draven leaned back slowly, folding his hands together. Laurent's breathing had steadied. His color had returned. He was safe, for now. But the storm in the cabin had only just begun. Across the aisle, the man who had dared endanger a child sat frozen in silence. And the landing wouldn't be on a runway. It would be into a courtroom. The sharp chime broke through the cabin's low hum like a warning bell. Draven looked up immediately, eyes narrowing as the encrypted tablet on Milo's lap vibrated with a second-level compliance alert from Linthera's ground division. Milo tapped it open without speaking. The screen glowed blue, then white, then red. His face changed. "They've suspended Rennick's license," Milo said under his breath, scrolling quickly. "Emergency flag. He's grounded upon landing." Draven didn't react with relief. He leaned closer, watching the alert unfold into something far more unsettling. A second message appeared almost instantly. This one marked, "Audit Preliminary Findings." A growing block of text revealed what neither of them had expected to see at cruising altitude. 4 write-ups, Milo muttered, all for emotional instability over the past year. Draven's eyes narrowed. "They're not in his active personnel file," Milo added, voice quiet but sharp. "These weren't missed. They were erased." For a moment, the cabin seemed to constrict around Draven's thoughts. The air didn't feel so thin as much as it felt weaponized, coated with something invisible, like a gas slowly leaking from a crack no one had seen. Draven sat back, silent. Not in shock, not even in anger. He was calculating, and the sum was not adding up in Rennick's favor. "He wasn't just unstable," Draven said, his voice low, almost reflective. "He was concealed. Someone wanted him flying." The weight of that truth hit harder than Rennick's actions alone. If the man had been a loose wire in a live system, then someone had knowingly tucked that wire behind insulation and hoped the sparks wouldn't reach the fuel. Milo's fingers moved fast across the secure console embedded into the armrest. The custom interface, available only to Linthera asset owners, let him access the network's internal audit trail. He began cross-referencing entries, incident codes, timestamps, system authors. Then he found it. Look at this. Milo turned the screen. All 4 reports were entered by different supervisors, but the deletion pattern is identical. Same metadata tag. Draven leaned forward, eyes scanning. The tag appeared like a signature buried beneath layers of code. DRX-TORID22. Torin Drax, Milo confirmed grimly. Scheduling manager, mid-seniority rank, has override access on internal rotation records, including wellness check flags and disciplinary annotations. Draven stared at the name for a long beat. Pull his internal routing pattern. I want to see if this was random or a setup. Milo nodded, fingers flying again. He knew what Draven was really asking. Was Rennick assigned to this flight because someone failed, or because someone thought no one would notice? The routing data revealed its truth with chilling clarity. Rennick had been scheduled onto Draven's flight by override, manual entry, not automated allocation. There were no corresponding entries showing roster conflicts or emergency substitutions. No justification. It wasn't an accident, Draven said quietly. They put him here. Milo's brows furrowed. But why? They didn't know you were the owner, did they? No, Draven said, and that's exactly why they did it. The realization felt like a switchblade sliding free. Rennick hadn't been assigned to punish Draven personally. He had been reassigned because the flight was presumed to be low risk, private, discreet, invisible. No one expected accountability here, just luxury, silence, and confidentiality. Draven rose slowly from his seat, walking to the bassinet and adjusting the edge of Laurent's blanket. The infant was sleeping again, the medicine having stabilized his tiny chest with each slow breath. Draven didn't touch him. He simply watched, reminded of how thin the line had been, how close it had come. He turned back to Milo. Draft a secondary report. This one's not about Rennick anymore. You want to go after Drax? Milo asked, already opening a new secured form. Draven nodded once. And the system that let this happen. I want oversight logs. I want cross-rosters. I want a review of any crew members flagged for psychological instability in the last 18 months and whether their reports vanished. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like architecture being laid for a much larger structure, a case not just against a man, but against a machine designed to bury men like him. Milo typed silently, the screen's glow reflecting off the lenses of his glasses. Outside the aircraft, clouds spread like silver brushstrokes across a darkening canvas. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed slightly for nighttime cruising, but the atmosphere remained bright with tension and rising consequence. Rennick Vale sat stiffly in his jump seat, unaware of the tidal wave about to crash over his career. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, then back at Draven and Milo, sensing the shift but not yet grasping its origin. He reached for a water bottle, his hand trembling slightly. The guilt had not arrived, but the gravity had. Draven's expression remained unreadable as he returned to his seat. 1,000 simulations raced behind his eyes, risk assessments, leadership failures, reform opportunities. This was no longer about a father protecting his child. It was about a designer of systems realizing one had betrayed him from the inside. Laurent stirred softly. Draven reached out and laid a calming hand over his son's chest, his palm steady despite the storm now brewing within him. Milo finished compiling the report, encrypting it under dual authorization. He slid the tablet toward Draven. You want to send it now? Draven didn't answer right away. He looked toward the cockpit, toward the quiet hum of the engines, toward the fragile veil of safety everyone assumed would always hold. Then, finally, he nodded. Send it. The file uploaded into the Linthera Secure Relay, flagged for executive compliance routing and internal investigation priority. Somewhere, far below, servers came alive. Logs were copied, access chains were traced. A system that had always looked the other way was now being forced to look inward. As the file vanished into the encrypted uplink, Draven whispered quietly, not to Milo, not even to the system, but to himself. And the true threat wasn't just in the cabin, it was in the system that sent Rennick there in the first place. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every move, every witness, and every corner of the jet was under the father's control. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The jet began its descent into Maranthor Airfield just as the final notification tone rang through the cabin, but the quiet hum of landing gear deployment was drowned beneath something far more electric, tension. Not the kind passengers usually feel during descent. This was sharper, heavier, personal. In seat 2A, Draven Keller sat in silence, Lerone asleep against his chest, tiny breaths warming the fabric of his shirt. But Draven's eyes were locked forward, calm yet intensely focused, his mind moving far faster than the plane. 3 investigations were already in motion. One against Rennick Vale, for endangerment, for negligence, for what couldn't be undone. The second aimed at Torin Drax, for tampering with records that had no business being touched. And the third, that one bore Draven's signature, a deep surgical inquiry into Linthera's own staffing oversight systems, because a system that let a man like Rennick near infants without review wasn't a flaw. It was a failure. Captain Velric Dane adjusted a few toggles on the console up front, but every so often his eyes drifted back through the cockpit door toward the cabin. There was no turbulence outside, yet he sensed it inside. Draven hadn't said much since administering the backup dosage, but something in his stillness spoke louder than any command. It was the kind of silence that made men watch their own behavior more closely. Rennick Vale sat near the service galley, posture unnaturally stiff, as though trying to disappear into the seat. His hands remained clasped, his eyes flicking between the floor and the slow-moving window beyond. For a brief moment, he looked like a man reconsidering every choice he had ever made. But when Draven turned his head and their eyes met, Rennick looked away. Too late. Draven had seen it. Not guilt, not fear, just defeat wrapped in bruised ego. Then came the bump, soft, steady, the wheels touching down on Maranthor's private runway. But instead of relief, the air thickened. Outside, ground vehicles were already waiting. Not ambulances, not fuel trucks, but black SUVs bearing the logo of Linthera's Internal Security Division. Their doors opened in eerie synchronicity as 6 men stepped out, identically dressed, earpieces in, clipboards in hand. The jet slowed to a halt, and for a long beat, no one moved. The cabin door hissed open. A senior officer stepped aboard, gave a curt nod to Captain Dane, then turned toward the cabin. His eyes scanned until they landed on Rennick. No words were exchanged. Only a gesture, 2 fingers down and out. Rennick stood slowly. His uniform, once pressed and proud, now looked like a costume abandoned after a poor performance. He did not speak. He did not apologize. Just a pale nod. He stepped forward and was escorted off the aircraft without resistance. Milo watched it all without blinking, his tablet already syncing security footage and time-stamped reports directly to Linthera's corporate press office. Draven didn't watch Rennick go. He had already moved on. With quiet precision, he adjusted the blanket over Laren's chest, stood, and walked down the stairs onto the tarmac. His steps were steady, unhurried, calculated. But then something unexpected happened. Waiting at the base of the mobile stairs was a man in a gray suit, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Draven recognized him instantly. Ryvan Kell, the lead investor he was originally supposed to pitch to that afternoon. The man who controlled the boardroom Draven had planned to walk into with slide decks and prototypes. The man who held the purse strings for the infant health monitoring device that had taken him 5 years to develop. Only Ryvan didn't look like someone expecting a pitch anymore. As Draven approached, Milo just behind him, Ryvan unfolded his arms and stepped forward. He extended his hand, palm firm, grip unwavering. "I've already heard everything," Ryvan said quietly. Draven didn't flinch. "You came for a proposal." Ryvan shook his head. "I came for a reason to invest. I just got one." There was no smile, no flourish, just respect, raw and unpolished. Milo raised a brow but said nothing, watching the moment unfold like an unexpected checkmate. Draven clasped Ryvan's hand, not with gratitude, but with clarity. The investor wasn't offering charity. He was offering alignment, because the way Draven handled danger wasn't with panic or noise, it was with precision, with restraint, with power held tightly in check. Around them, the airfield moved in slow rhythm, ground crews refueling jets, technicians inspecting engines. But none of it touched the circle of stillness surrounding the three men. Draven didn't speak again. He didn't need to. And just like that, the flight meant to deliver a pitch had delivered something greater, proof of leadership under fire. The report went public within hours of touchdown. Draven Keller never intended for the incident to reach the public eye, but Linthera's automated compliance feed, programmed to trigger transparency protocols under very specific conditions, had quietly flagged the entire event as high priority. The criteria had been met in chilling succession: the endangered health of an infant, the misuse of authority by a registered crew member, and the rare override by a jet's executive-level owner. The system did what it was designed to do. It told the world. The headline struck like lightning across digital news platforms. Private jet attendant flushed baby's medicine, didn't know the father owned the aircraft. It was more than sensational. It was surgical in its precision, carrying both outrage and irony in equal measure. Within hours, parenting forums exploded. Aviation safety watchdogs issued demands. Thousands of comments poured in, all asking the same thing. How could this happen in a private cabin? What they didn't expect, what no one expected, was Draven's response. No press conference, no emotional video, no outraged post. Instead, Milo Dane uploaded a single PDF file to the Linthera Public Compliance Portal, authored quietly by Draven himself. The title was as unassuming as it was devastating. Invisible Threats in the Sky, a case study in infant endangerment and systemic oversight. In clear, unembellished language, Draven detailed every moment of the flight, from the exchange over the bottle, to Rennick Vale's refusal to hand it back, to the flush that changed the course of the journey. He didn't name himself in the introduction. The story led with the facts, not the identity. But what made the report truly piercing was its second half. Draven used anonymized data from Rennick's behavioral logs, comparing them against dozens of de-escalation protocols used in public aviation. He pointed out the moments where danger could have been prevented, where personality screening should have raised red flags, where authority should have been questioned, and where policy had quietly failed. He didn't attack the system. He dissected it. And what he found beneath the surface wasn't a monster. It was a blind spot. This wasn't a singular act of recklessness, one paragraph read, but the final moment in a long chain of unacknowledged behaviors. Had we caught the first 5, we wouldn't be speaking about the 6th. The file went viral in less than 24 hours. Aviation forums began quoting sections. Safety regulators in Miranthor flagged it for internal training. Within days, parents across 3 countries were citing its framework in letters to their airlines. Behind the scenes, Milo fielded dozens of inquiries from board officials, journalists, even quietly concerned pilots. One particular call came from Ryvan Kell, the lead investor who had originally expected a product pitch from Draven, now realizing the pitch had already happened, just not in a boardroom. He didn't just control the jet, Riven told one of his airline contacts in a closed-door briefing. He controlled the fallout, without ever raising his voice. Meanwhile, Draven watched the ripple from a distance. He hadn't meant to start a movement, but the data told its own story, and what mattered was how quickly it was being read by the right people. "Will you speak to the media?" Milo asked one night, glancing up from another inbox flooded with interview requests. Draven shook his head. "The story isn't me. It's the system. Let them focus there." Milo nodded slowly, though his fingers continued typing replies. But underneath the public explosion, a quieter storm brewed. A few anonymous tip-offs were already hinting at deeper problems in Linthera's crew assignment database, suggesting Rennick Vale might not have been the only risk overlooked. Draven bookmarked each one. He wasn't finished. The world had seen the bottle go down the drain, but now it was seeing the truth rise from the wreckage. And with every page read, the truth did what the bottle could not. It saved others before the damage was done. Rennick Vale's termination was swift, but the ripple that followed struck far deeper than the surface. Hours after the incident, while the jet still sat quietly under hangar lights at Maranthor Airfield, an encrypted channel linked Draven Keller's report to the central compliance grid of Linthera Holdings. What began as a simple misconduct file suddenly burst into a multidimensional audit. Within 12 hours, two things were clear. Rennick wasn't the only one who had been shuffled onto discrete, lower visibility routes after erratic behavior, and someone had been actively covering for him. The first confirmed breach came from a historical roster Draven quietly requested from Linthera's internal logs. Milo sorted through it in silence, his eyes hardening as he mapped out a pattern. Names like Rennick Vale, Joran Helst, Merrick Dross, each flagged previously for emotional instability or confrontational behavior, had all served on private or underreported charter flights. There was a trend. Unstable staff quietly reassigned instead of removed. "Look at this," Milo murmured, turning his tablet toward Draven. 4 separate attendants from the same crew rotation had flagged evaluations. Scrubbed. The only name consistent across all scheduling decisions, Torin Drax. Draven leaned forward, scanning the data. Torin Drax, senior scheduling manager, trusted with executive routing and last-minute assignments. The same man who had placed Rennick on their flight just 2 days earlier. Draven's fingers curled slightly on the table's edge. He had flown through storms before, real storms, systems failures, field emergencies, but this was different. This was rot, deep inside the walls, and it had nearly taken his child's breath away. "What are you going to do?" Milo asked, his voice low, respectful. Draven's answer was quiet, certain. "We're not just going to report a man. We're going to expose a system." He moved quickly. A secure virtual conference was initiated between Draven, Milo, and Ryvan Kell, the lead investor and now the silent force behind everything Draven would propose next. Ryvan listened in silence, jaw clenched, as Draven laid out the next phase. "We need a monitoring protocol. Not for passengers, for crew," Draven said. "Biometric check-ins, behavioral tracking based on emotional pulse shifts, voice modulation records, predictive incident heat maps. We call it Project Sentryline." Ryvan didn't blink. "How soon can it be deployed?" "I already built half the framework for neonatal device monitoring. It just needs to be adapted," Draven replied. "Milo can start onboarding within the week." Within 72 hours, the gears began turning. Sentryline's mission was precise: to identify early markers of psychological volatility among flight crews, especially those placed in proximity to passengers with medical fragility, like infants or the elderly. Where standard HR reviews failed, CenturyLine would intervene. Its design wasn't intrusive. It was preventative. Each crew member would be screened at key stress intervals. Data remained secure, but red flags would automatically trigger priority review. Torrin Drax never saw it coming. The algorithm pulled metadata from his scheduling terminal. Hidden logs, administrative overrides, clearance gaps, a shadow map of every reassignment he had made in the last year. Milo's audit compiled them into a single file, which Draven forwarded to Linthera's Executive Ethics Board under the subject line, Predictable Crisis, Systemic Enabling of Passenger Endangerment. A reply came just 12 minutes later. Drax's clearance was suspended. Internal security notified. Criminal tampering investigations initiated. But that was only the beginning. Draven didn't speak to the press. He didn't schedule interviews. Instead, he sent private invitations, directly to other executives who had quietly experienced similar dangers. A father whose child had gone into diabetic shock midair without assistance. A grandfather whose oxygen request had been delayed by an irritated crewman. Behind boardroom doors, stories were shared. Fears voiced, alliances formed. CenturyLine grew from a protocol into a movement. Backed by Riven's funding and protected under Linthera's legal arm, it was offered to the first 12 private carriers as a no-cost pilot integration. The response was immediate. These weren't bureaucratic proposals. These were solutions built by someone who had lived through it and refused to let it happen again. Draven, in one late-night meeting, summed up his position with brutal clarity. This isn't a reaction. This is prevention. My son survived. Others may not. Fixing that isn't optional. It's overdue. Milo, ever composed, managed the onboarding while refining internal simulations. Crew members would not be punished for stress, but they would no longer fly unchecked. Patterns would be flagged. Reviews would be mandatory. And every cockpit, galley, and aisle would now be considered a place where safety didn't just mean the plane could fly, but that the people on board were safe from the people serving them. By the end of the first week, the system flagged 3 more crew members for preemptive counseling. Quiet interventions, no drama, just adjustments before something broke. Draven received a single message from one of those crew members, anonymous but heartfelt. "Thank you. I didn't even know I was that close to slipping. You saved me before I hurt someone." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His reply was already in motion, coded into the sky. And sometimes the most dangerous turbulence isn't in the clouds, but in the people we trust to serve above them. Draven didn't hesitate. The moment Liron's breathing returned to normal after receiving the backup dose mid-flight, Draven Keller had already begun reshaping his entire protocol for travel. What happened aboard that jet, the flushed bottle, the crew members' cold indifference, the narrow escape from tragedy, wasn't something he would let go unguarded again. Not ever. By the following week, Draven had 3 new standing orders written into his personal travel routine: carry triple redundant medication packs in 3 separate compartments, employ a certified pediatric nurse for all long-haul flights, and personally test and lock every medical item in tamper-proof containers that even cabin crew could not access without biometric authorization. These weren't precautions. They were scars turned into systems. Liron, thankfully, recovered fully. Within days, the color returned to his cheeks, and the soft rise and fall of his breathing no longer carried the haunting rhythm of desperation. Yet even as the infant slept peacefully beside him on the terrace of their lakeside home, Draven's mind circled the same question again and again. What if I hadn't been the owner? What if the man in seat 4A hadn't had override clearance? What if he had just been another father with no title, no authority, only hope that someone might listen? The thought chewed at him with a slow, gnawing pressure. Not because he feared for himself, but because he knew how many others had no shield to raise when something went wrong in the sky. One morning, as the clouds broke over Velthron Bay, Draven sat across from Reven Kell, the man who had invested millions into his medical project without ever hearing a single slide of the pitch. "I've been thinking about something," Draven said, folding his fingers around a porcelain coffee mug. "We need a system, not just hardware, but something embedded into every flight, something passengers can reach even when no one's listening." Riven, usually quick to interrupt with ideas, didn't this time. He nodded, letting Draven continue. "Voice flight," Draven said. "A legal hotline, secure, embedded in every Linthera jet. No ranks, no permissions. If you're on board, you have the right to be heard, immediately and directly, crew or passenger." Riven leaned back in his chair, absorbing the idea with a slow exhale. "No hierarchy," he murmured. "No fear." "Exactly," Draven said. "Not just for people like me who own the plane. For the fathers who don't. For the mother who can't speak. For the passenger who gets silenced before help arrives." Within weeks, Draven and Milo began assembling the system's framework. Milo, now officially promoted to Director of Risk Protocols at the newly formed Sentry Line Division, oversaw the tech side, encryption layers, emergency routing protocols, and live-link authentication to a regulatory response network. Every piece was designed with one goal: make the unheard heard. Meanwhile, Draven worked with manufacturers to develop something born directly from the helplessness he'd felt that day: the infant emergency capsule. It was a sleek, pressurized crib with built-in health sensors, oxygen reserves, and 2-hour emergency autonomy. It wasn't about replacing parents. It was about protecting infants when no one else would. The irony didn't escape anyone close to him. Draven never did present his original product at the Miranthor Summit. After the incident, Riven Kell simply funded the entire development cycle on principle. "If your kids survived because of something you built," Riven had said, "then I want to help build more of them." That funding now supported hospitals across 3 cities, equipping them with real-time infant monitoring tools, products that would never have seen mass adoption if not for one crew member's reckless decision. But even amid the growing success, Draven couldn't shake the haunting clarity of that mid-air moment. The look in Rennick Vale's eyes, the sound of the medicine pouring into the sink, the sheer arrogance of assuming a parent's desperation was an exaggeration. It wasn't about vengeance. Draven hadn't sued. And on every Linthera jet now, hidden behind a small panel beneath the reading light, was a soft green button, marked not with a symbol of power, but with a symbol of voice. Justice didn't start in the cockpit or the boardroom. Draven knew that now. It started in the quietest row, in the middle seat, beside the crying child. And for every parent without a title, voice flight would be the one title that mattered. Draven stepped onto the stage without ceremony. No video montage, no thunderous intro. Just quiet footsteps echoing in the wide auditorium of the Velbrin City Aviation Ethics Forum, where rows of top-tier airline executives, regulators, and private carriers sat in pressed suits and curious silence. The lighting was clinical, sterile, like a boardroom suspended in theater. A single podium stood in the center beneath a muted spotlight. And behind it, no PR team, no slides, no data charts, only Draven Keller, the man the industry had whispered about for months. He looked out at the crowd, not with arrogance but with the steady gaze of someone who had seen through smoke and fire and chosen to walk forward anyway. In his hand was a simple note card, but he didn't look at it. "I'm not here to present forecasts," he began, his voice low and even. "I'm here to tell you about a bottle." Chairs shifted. Pens stopped. The room settled into an attentive hush. "My son, Liron, was 6 months old when we boarded a private jet I technically owned, but the crew didn't know that. The flight attendant didn't ask. And when he took my son's only dose of respiratory medicine and flushed it, he didn't think there'd be consequences. Just another passenger. Just another cry. Just another bottle." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He didn't know I designed the very equipment that keeps premature infants alive in hospitals. He didn't know I had clearance to override the cockpit. He didn't know I was watching, not just as a father, but as someone who built systems to save lives. Draven paused. A faint mechanical hum of the ceiling lights was all that answered him. I watched him look at that bottle like it was trash. Then I listened to the silence after he flushed it. And that silence, he said, slowly pacing from one side of the stage to the other, is the same silence we've all let live in the skies for far too long. He stopped. The spotlight followed. It's not just one man's mistake. It's a pattern, an assumption, that the uniform we trust is always right, that authority can't be questioned, that protocols are more important than people. Someone in the front row uncrossed his legs, visibly uncomfortable. Another scribbled something into a notebook but didn't look up. I had every reason to explode, Draven continued. My child couldn't breathe, and I watched it happen. I could have yelled, thrown punches, demanded arrests, but instead, he held up a small token-sized device. I triggered a review system I'd had quietly installed for emergencies. I streamed his actions in real time, logged it, built a case. He let the object drop gently onto the podium with a soft click. Because screaming might have satisfied my rage, but systems change the world. A beat. He didn't just flush a bottle, Draven said, voice tightening. He flushed a child's right to breathe. If I had screamed at him, the world would have forgotten it in a week. But I didn't scream. I built a system to stop him. And that's why you're all here. The final words fell like iron across the room. A long silence followed, longer than any pause that had come before. Then, without signal or cue, a chair scraped backward as one CEO stood. He didn't say a word, just extended a hand across the aisle in silent agreement. Another followed, then another. Some executives shook Draven's hand with quiet respect. Others stepped into the aisle to meet Milo, seated near the stage edge asking about CenturyLine adoption steps. Above them all, the spotlight still glowed, but the man beneath it had already stepped back, his work not to impress, but to imprint. That day, the flight Draven never wanted to remember became a lesson no one in aviation would ever forget. And the cabin that once held silence now echoed across every sky as a warning and a promise. The envelope trembled slightly in Milo's hand as he crossed the smooth stone path toward the cedar tree. The late afternoon sun spilled gold across the surface of the private lake, brushing the edges of the estate in a silence only nature could hold. Underneath that cedar, Draven Keller sat unmoving, his infant son, Laron, asleep on his lap, one tiny hand curled over his father's finger. Draven didn't look up at first. His gaze remained fixed on the water, the slow, rhythmic waves lapping gently against the stone shoreline as if to match his breathing. There was a quietness in his posture, not of rest, but of reflection, like a storm that had passed but left the landscape forever altered. When Milo finally reached him, he said nothing, just extended the envelope with a single hand. Draven took it, thumb sliding under the seal without haste. He read the contents once, then again, slower the second time. A soft chuckle escaped him, not amused, not surprised, but knowing. "They want me on the Federal Aviation Advisory Board," he murmured. Milo nodded. "It's official. They sent a personal endorsement from Ryven Kell, and 3 other executives signed off after your forum speech." Draven exhaled slowly through his nose. "I wasn't planning on becoming a policymaker." "No one who builds safeguards ever is," Milo replied, sitting on the bench beside him, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. Draven didn't answer right away. He glanced down at Laron, whose breath now moved evenly, rhythmically, as if the sky had finally forgiven them both. His mind wandered, but not far. It always returned to that flight, the metallic sound of a flushed bottle, the raw helplessness, the restraint it took not to strike Rennick in that narrow aisle, the precision it demanded to outmaneuver him instead. "I can still see his face," Draven said quietly. right before he did it, like he thought he was the hero. Milo looked away, jaw tightening. That man was a hazard in uniform, but he was also a symptom, not the cause. You cut through both. Draven nodded faintly, though his expression stayed distant. What if I hadn't been the owner? What if I didn't have the authority, the override codes, the leverage? What would have happened to Laron then? Silence answered him, heavy and truthful. That's why voice flight matters, Milo said, because power shouldn't be the price of safety. Draven finally leaned back, his gaze lifting to the sky. Clear. Endless. A sky no child should fear. His thoughts turned not to the investors or the applause at the forum, but to the cabin silence after the bottle had been flushed. That hollow, unreal stillness. It hadn't screamed like an emergency, but it had been one. A quiet, invisible theft of safety, the kind people miss until it's too late. I didn't just react to that day, he said. I rewired it. I took a fault line and turned it into a firewall. He glanced at Milo. That's the difference between revenge and reform. One stops a man, the other stops the system that made him possible. Milo offered a small, respectful nod. You rewrote altitude. Draven smiled faintly at that, then rose slowly, cradling Laron in his arms, the boy's head resting peacefully against his shoulder. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as he stepped onto the grass and looked once more to the open blue above them. Behind him, the world was shifting, systems being rebuilt, oversight being born, safeguards taking root not because of a tragedy, but because someone had the clarity to stop shouting and start building. The advisory board invitation remained on the bench, fluttering slightly in the breeze, a symbol of what came next. Draven didn't need the title, but perhaps the skies did. He whispered softly, almost to himself, almost to Laron. And this time, the only thing rising in the air was peace. Seconds later, the father confronted him, enforcing accountability, freezing the crew, and making it clear who ruled the aircraft. The attendant's arrogance evaporated instantly. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision, courage, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores negligence, abuse of authority, and the consequences of underestimating someone in a position of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.